I'm joined now by a member of the House of Lords who, since 2005, has served as a crossbench peer and chaired the Bar Standards Board from 2009 until 2014, not to mention she is a Brandeis alum. On behalf of myself and Brandeis University, Baroness Ruth Deech, thank you for joining the program today.
It's a pleasure. It's nice to think about Brandeis again.
As I mentioned your position, I believe most of our listeners are unfamiliar with the term crossbench peer. Could you explain that?
Well, the House of Lords is a rather strange institution. In some ways, it's equivalent to your Senate, but in other ways, not. We have several party groupings in the House of Lords. There are the Conservatives. They make up about 1/3 of the House of Lords, and of course, they're in power at the moment. We have a Labour grouping in the House of Lords, slightly fewer. We have Lib Dem, Liberal Democrats, bishops, and a sizable group like me who are independent. We don't sign up to any of the parties, which is great because we can vote whichever way we feel our conscience tells us to. So we are liberated, as it were, it's very good. It's a good position to be in, yes.
I was also wondering if briefly you could explain your journey to becoming a Baroness.
Well,
I know that's a large ask.
Yes. I came from a refugee family. My father was a refugee from the Nazis, and he managed to get to England in 1939, just in time. He always told me that he meant to get to the USA, but he never got there in time. And we were a very Zionist household, impoverished, but very Zionist, and he worked for the World Jewish Congress. I went through the English school system, private school, as a scholarship child. I went to Oxford University and I studied law. In England, you do law as an undergraduate. So I'd finished with my law by the age of about 21 or 22. And then I thought, well, I'm not sure I want to do. What am I going to do? And I thought, I really want to go to America because I'd always had this great fascination with your country and great admiration for what you'd done in the Second World War and how you helped us afterwards. And in those days, there was no internet. I remember sitting on the floor of the library in Rhodes House, the Centre for the Rhodes Scholars. And I later on became a trustee of those scholarships. I remember sitting on the floor and going through all the brochures of the universities, starting with A. And I got to B for Brandeis, and I could see a course that really interested me, Contemporary Jewish Studies. And I wrote off to several universities, and immediately Brandeis wrote back and offered me a scholarship. So off I went, together with a Fulbright scholarship from Britain. And I had a fantastic year, which maybe we'll come back to. But once I'd been to America, I decided to come home and resume my law studies. And I qualified as a barrister. I worked in a law reform organization. And then I started teaching because I was never that keen on practicing law, but I really liked researching and philosophizing about the great issues of the day. In the late 60s, those great issues were capital punishment, marriage reform, homosexuality, suicide, and so on. And I worked in reform. And then I got a job teaching at Oxford University. I was really quite young. I got that post and stayed there teaching for the next 21 years. I worked my way up through the colleges and universities' administrative system. I enjoyed committee work. I was always one for taking on something. If they said, who's going to volunteer, I was going to put my hand up. And the college elected me to be their principal, which is like provost or chancellor of the college. And that opened the door to a life of public service. I was then nominated to chair the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. You don't have an equivalent in the States. It's the British body that monitors all reproductive assisted treatments, IVF, embryos, egg and sperm donation, and so on. And we monitor it not only ethically, but actually by inspecting the laboratories. And the great issue in my time was Dolly the sheep. You may not remember, Dolly the sheep was the first ever cloned mammal. And we at the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority realized that although cloning humans is a bad thing, to be able to clone cells to grow stem cells, which now and much more in the future can be used to repair failing tissues and organs in a human, is a good thing. Already stem cells are being used, I think, in the treatment of eyesight and heart problem. We realized that, and we persuaded the government to allow the artificial manufacture of embryos to produce stem cells, which you didn't allow in the States. I'm not sure you can do it now. So I did that. And then I decided to leave the college, because I always think you should leave a job when they still say, oh, you're great, don't go, rather than staying till they say, when is she going, when is she going? And I took another job as the national adjudicator of student complaints in all British universities. If a student had a problem which the university could not solve, they could come to my office and we would give a sort of legal judgment. Students who said, for example, they paid for good accommodation and didn't get it, paid for courses and the professors didn't show up, and so on. And then Britain changed the system for getting into the House of Lords. In about 2000, a new system was set up whereby independent-minded people like me, who weren't going to join a political party, could apply to join, like a job. And I applied along with 15,000 others in the year 2000. I heard nothing for 5 years. And then 5 years later, I got a phone call. I was nominated by Tony Blair. And I became a baroness. And I think my first thought was, if only my parents, my father, the refugee, my mother, whose mother died in a concentration camp, if only they could have been alive to see that moment. So I did that. I've been there 16 years. I've done other things as well. As I said, I was a trustee of the Rhodes Scholarship. I work a lot for Jewish organizations. And amongst other things in the House of Lords, I make it my business to stand up for Israel, to stand against anti-Semitism, and to do what I can in particular for Jewish students who are suffering, as I think they are in the States too, from very nasty campus anti-Semitism. So I do that and a whole host of other things. So that was my path.
As you talk about your position in schooling and education, how do you believe your experiences in those have helped your decision-making in Parliament?
Well, can I start with Brandeis?
Sure. And then I guess the other question is, was there ever an interest in education, or was it more the administrative factor?
Well, I did like education. Of all the jobs I've done, the nicest was teaching my students. Okay. I had wonderful students. And I do enjoy sort of propagating issues and so on. But I also enjoy committees and administration. I think many women don't, but I do. I spent a lot of time on university administration. I was responsible for getting Oxford University to start a chain of daycare nurseries for staff, more staff than students who had babies, so that women could get back to work. I started Oxford's first Equal Opportunities Committee. So yes, I did enjoy administration, but I also enjoy teaching my students. There's no greater pleasure than, even now, if I'm walking around London or I'm somewhere and somebody taps me on the shoulder and says, hey, Mrs. Deech, do you remember me? You told me that I might be a good barrister, and I am, I did it. Or someone stopped me and said, I came to you when I was running out of money and you managed to get me a bursary and I did okay. And that gives me a real pleasure to help bright young people along the way. So that's very nice too, yes.
As you spoke about Brandeis, what drew you specifically to this school, and what skills did you learn here that translate to where you are today and the policies you advocate for and against?
Well, as the years go by, I come to appreciate it more and more. I was drawn to America because I'd always loved America. I mean, during the war, I remember my parents getting food parcels from the States, and they used to include comic magazines, which I read, Little Lulu and Charlie Brown, all that sort of thing. And I watched American movies and I thought, oh, this is great. And of course, JFK, the great excitement of that. And I was at Oxford University that terrible night. It was nighttime for us when we got the news that he was assassinated. In fact, that particular night in November was the first date I had with my husband, a fellow student then. And for us, it's always associated with, we stopped everything, we turned on the radio. We heard that JFK had been assassinated. And I was drawn to Brandeis because it was Jewish and it was standing up for, I think, all the people who in those days might have found it more difficult to get into other universities. And I loved the look of the courses. I did contemporary Jewish studies. It was a fantastic course. It taught me to understand much, much more about Jewish history. I'm not particularly religious, not at all, but I'm very keen on Jewish and Zionist history. And it was a wonderful course with fantastic teachers. This was 1965 to 66. And I did a thesis on Jacob de Haas, who was the Zionist secretary of Louis D. Brandeis. So I arrived in Brandeis and it was a real culture shock because, this was before the internet. I didn't really know what it was like. And it was very strange because Oxford is, as you know, old, and there was Brandeis, all brand new and concrete buildings. And the language was different. My fellow students said to me, "What school did you go to?" I thought, that's a very strange question. Who cares where I went to school? And I told them. And it took me ages before I realized that when they said school, they meant what we would call university. And if I said Oxford, their reaction would be much different. And I also remember them talking about going out on the Mass Pike. Mass Pike, I thought, what could that be? I thought Pike, I thought it must be a river. I couldn't figure out what they were talking about. And of course, I couldn't drive in those days because it was quite unusual for young British people to drive. So I was a bit stranded, but there was a little train that used to go from the middle of the road, then it still does, just outside the campus, into Harvard Square. And I used to go into Harvard Square and buy foreign newspapers and have ice cream. There was a wonderful ice cream parlor there. And I used to hang around Harvard Law School and audit some courses there. So I had a very good time. I found some things very strange. Why were people eating lunch at 11 o'clock in the morning and dinner at 5 in the evening? And why did they all wear the same jacket, the sort of red and black check or blue and black check sort of lumber jacket? They all wore the same. Whereas I turned up in high heels and tight-fitting dresses. Anyway. And I remember Thanksgiving. I was invited to a Thanksgiving lunch. I didn't know it was lunch. I was invited for Thanksgiving at 3 o'clock. I thought 3 o'clock. So I had lunch at 12 or 1, got there and found there was an enormous meal being served up by Rabbi Alexander Altman, who was a very distinguished member of the faculty. And I learned a lot about Americans, and I traveled all over the place, and I just loved it. It's given me a lifelong love of your country. Sometimes you have presidents that I don't care for that much, but I'm very loyal to my memory of America. I've been back many times, and it helped me appreciate something that was quite un-English then. I got to America for the first time and I realized it didn't matter what your name was, what your religion was, what your background was. If you have the will to achieve, you could. The doors were open. And I still get that feeling now. Whenever I go, of course I haven't been able to go for a couple of years because of COVID, I get a shot of adrenaline. Yes, I can do this. Yes, we can do the other. It revives me and energizes me. And I mix with all sorts of people. I think largely they were older than me. And I do remember one thing, sadly. I remember discussing with my fellow classmates anti-Semitism in Europe, which, it wasn't that long after the Second World War, it was only 20 years later. And they all said, oh, this would never happen in America. America is the golden Medina, the Yiddish for the Golden State. And I said, I'm not so sure, the Germans thought that. And in fact, I was right. It comes back sooner or later. But that was quite a mind-opening experience. I learned to adapt. It took me nearly a year to adapt, and then it was time to go home. But that feeling of, yes, you can do it. Yes, we're all in it together. Life can be better. I think that did a lot for me. Of course, your living standards were much higher too. We didn't have supermarkets like you did then, or cars or anything. So I was quite taken aback. And I had one friend there, Richard Epstein, who'd been in Oxford, who is now retired, but he was a very distinguished law professor at Yale. And I stayed with his family in, I think it was Great Neck when I arrived. And I've never seen a house like it. It was just beyond anything I'd imagined. I felt a bit like a peasant. But it was mind-opening, and I think it did a lot for me, yes.
I wanted to switch and talk about current events. More than a year into this pandemic, are you satisfied overall with how Parliament has handled the coronavirus and the legislation passed by your colleagues?
Many people say that our legislation has been too rushed and too drastic. I don't actually agree. I don't think that the government has a malevolent attitude. I think the restrictions on us will go when that pandemic is over. And I suppose as an older person and a woman, I'm only too glad to have restrictions. So I think we've handled it quite well, in particular, the vaccination. There were many mistakes made earlier in the process. We didn't have enough protective equipment. We kept changing, well, the government kept changing its mind about what to do, lockdown, not lockdown, financially how to help businesses. But we certainly got the vaccination going. I was doubly vaccinated, as was my husband, more than 6 months ago. And the AstraZeneca vaccine, of course, was a British invention. So that was very good, though there were some difficulties earlier on. But then if you look around the world, nearly every country had their problems. You had your problems. Germany, we thought at first was doing very well, and then it wasn't. The same with Australia. So I don't blame the governments. I mean, I kept saying to myself, if I was in your shoes thinking of a government minister, what decision would I make in this question of life and death? But we're not through yet. I mean, we're being told to start living normally, but actually the number of deaths every day is really quite high. We're still getting about 150 deaths a day. So it's by no means over. I'm still wearing a mask. I'm still very cautious, and I'm getting my third vaccination in a few days' time.
Okay.
But I feel for the government. I think it's been very difficult.
As an outside observer, yet also one to interact with policies implemented by the Biden administration, overall, how satisfied are you and or your colleagues with President Biden thus far?
Well, I'm sorry to say, not at all. I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
I was just going to ask about your thoughts on that as well.
I thought that was really, really too hurried and tragic and not at all well planned. I know that President Trump committed to it, but President Biden could have put more thought into the days, the dates, how to get certain people out. We were all pretty shocked by that, I have to say. So I don't like that. Nor do I approve of his resumption, apparently weekly, to the Iran nuclear deal, which I think isn't worth the paper it's written on, and will encourage Iran to carry on developing a nuclear bomb, which they've nearly got to. Nor is he handling the migrant crisis on your southern border well. So no, I'm not pleased. And again, you won't like this, but he comes across on our television as not in command of his brief, forgetting his words, stumbling, generally not impressive at all. I understand that he's not President Trump, which is what led a lot of people to vote for him. But I'm surprised that in your great, great country of more than 300 million people, you couldn't come up with anything better and younger than Presidents Trump and Biden. So no, I'm not impressed with President Biden. He's also a bit of a threat to Israel in that he is refunding UNRWA. He doesn't seem to understand what a threat they are, and he's not very good on the British Northern Ireland question either. So no, I'm finding it hard to say anything good about him, except that he's not Trump.
Okay. Can you share with our audience in 2017 how you came to make a supporting decision for Brexit and why that was the best option?
Yes, I have been a keen Brexiteer, as we say, for at least 30 years. It's all right to have Europe as a trading bloc, but once it opened its doors to a lot of countries from Eastern Europe, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Austria, countries that for the last century have known nothing except communism, Nazism, and occupation. Countries to whom the concept of democracy and the rule of law is either very new or very foreign. Then I got extremely worried. And then I could see the gradual erosion of human rights across Europe. Poland's record, for example, in curbing the independence of judges, carrying on polluting the atmosphere when they shouldn't, cracking down on the freedom of press, curbing abortion, refusing to pay restitution to the survivors of Jewish people, 3 million Jewish people who had property in Poland that was taken from them. They were killed by the Nazis, and Poland is sitting on that property. the rise of anti-Semitism and the far right in Hungary and in Germany, the waves of terrorism across France and Belgium and Italy, the shambles of government in Italy and Austria. I couldn't see anything to admire in Europe. And delving into it, it seems to me that Jewish people, anyway, do not thrive well in empires. And to my mind, Europe has changed from being a small trading bloc of like-minded nations into a big, sprawling empire, which has to exert an iron rule from the center, Brussels, in order to hold together a disparate group of countries, some of which they've allowed financially to go to the wall, like Greece, while Germany prospers. I don't like it at all. I'm delighted that we have left. To me, it is a moral decision to leave, not a trading decision.
Do you still believe the correct decision was made even amidst this pandemic where numerous European nations, including Great Britain, have struggled economically?
Of course it was the right decision. We got vaccination going long before they did. COVID was going to happen whether we had Brexit or not. It was bound to cause a financial struggle. And even if there is financial difficulty caused by Brexit as opposed to COVID, it's worth it. I've always been prepared to pay something towards getting out from the clutches of this empire, which is lurching to the right. It is not good for Jews and minorities. It's not good for gays and Roma either. It's not on a good path, the EU, and I want to be out almost at any cost.
As we talk about this pandemic and your policy interests, including divorce law and health services and medicine, how do you think your perception of all that has changed during this pandemic?
It hasn't changed.
Okay.
I'm not sure the pandemic has had as much effect as your question implies. The pandemic has caused a lot of people to stay at home, like me, and do lots of things on Zoom rather than traveling to London. There were fears that the divorce rate would soar, but it doesn't seem to have happened. People managed to have jogged along comfortably together during lockdown. I think there's been a very bad effect on children, on young children who've missed a lot of school, who are suffering mental health problems. I think the pandemic may have caused much more poverty amongst struggling families, even though our government has spent billions trying to help them. So I think there are mental health and family problems arising from the pandemic, but I wouldn't say that they're anything to do with divorce law or family law as such. They're more social and mental health issues.
Okay. Last week, China's ambassador to the country was barred from parliament after the imposition of sanctions on members of parliament by Beijing. How do you believe China and Great Britain can improve relations and move past this obstacle?
Well, it's an even bigger problem in Europe, of course, because they're much keener on trading with China than we are. I think we have to be resolute. I come back to human rights again. I believe that China's record on human rights with the Uyghurs is so bad that we must be very, very cautious in our dealings with China. A new commission is being set up as I speak to discover whether or not the Chinese deliberately or negligently allowed the coronavirus to escape from their laboratory in Wuhan. And if that is the case, they have a lot to answer for. I think we can only improve relations with China by standing up to them on a footing of equality. And I don't like the way that Germany, for example, has tried too hard to appease China and indeed Russia. We also can exercise soft power. We have hundreds of thousands of Chinese students studying in our universities. And my hope is that those Chinese students who studied with us and have learned the rather critical British way of tackling studies will go back to China with a more open mind and a mind more open to the way that the West does things.
As a student minoring in journalism, I'm curious, after serving as the governor of the BBC from 2002 until 2006, how have your views of broadcast media changed?
I think broadcast media is so important in our lives. We take it for granted. It is the biggest possible influence, maybe even more so than politicians. And of course, with broadcast media, you've also got what you and I are doing, podcasts, social media, the internet, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and all the rest of it, Twitter. Tremendously influential on young people, though I'm rather sorry that many young people get their news from the internet rather than listening to serious radio, serious television, reading serious newspapers. But I think it's extremely important. My time at the BBC persuaded me, even more than before, that it's absolutely essential in our country anyway, to have news stations that do their very best to be impartial. To be totally impartial is almost impossible, but I do think that news media should try very hard to be impartial. I also grew to admire the expertise within the BBC, the way that the World Service is admired all over the world. Many benighted countries think the World Service is their one door to hearing the truth. But it also made me worry about the BBC's own impartiality, especially in relation to reporting Israel. There's a problem there, as there is with the New York Times, and I don't think that the BBC is as impartial as it should be. And the New York Times certainly isn't when it comes to reporting Israel. Probably other things too, but that's what I took a particular interest in. And I lived through some turbulent times at the BBC, the Lebanon War, where there were issues about reporting, and then a situation you probably don't know about in the USA, concerning a scientist called Dr. David Kelly, who committed suicide, and a famous broadcast where Tony Blair had said that we had to invade Iraq because at 45 minutes notice we could be bombed, and of course this turned out to be untrue. There were issues there that led to the invasion of Iraq that came up while I was the governor of the BBC. There was a lot of turmoil, but I came to appreciate it. It is a very, very valuable thing, and it's the one thing I miss when I'm in the States. I turn the radio knobs, I go through all the television channels. I can't find anything I want to listen to. Really, I do miss the BBC when I'm there.
It is, as someone who is an aspiring, hopeful member of broadcast media, it is frustrating to listen to a lot of commercials, a lot of opinions, yet there's not as much evidence. And that today in the United States, I think of networks, it's kind of like C-SPAN, which focus on the United States House and the United States Senate, and also the BBC abroad, and others, including Reuters. But I agree completely that it is extremely difficult to find media that does not have a bias or an opinion, because as the viewer, you are trying to make that yourself, not listen to someone else's.
I like your PBS and the Smithsonian Channel when I can get it, and I like CNN. I think public service broadcasting is very important, as is cultural broadcasting. I always miss classical music when I'm in the States, because we have channels that broadcast classical music, and I don't find that when I'm in other countries.
Well, this has been a tremendous interview. Baroness Deech, thank you for taking the time to join the program today.
Well, it's very nice to remember Brandeis. It was very formative in my life. I was very grateful to Brandeis for giving me a scholarship and for teaching me Jewish studies, which has stood me in very good stead, and for exposing me to some marvelous professors and to your way of life. And it stayed with me for the next 50 years as a great moment in my life. So thank you very much indeed. And good luck to you.
Thank you.